Hey, Robin.
Hello,
Good to see
Joe.
you again.
I We met in person when I came up and gave a guest lecture for Steven Pinker's class on prediction
That's right.
markets
That's
two
right.
years ago, maybe,
That was a lot of fun. And I think we may have met when I gave a talk down
at George
at
Mason.
George Mason.
That's
That's
right.
right.
You came and gave a talk, and I asked some question, I believe, after your talk about fertility, whether you thought we'd fix that, and you said, "Nah, probably not."
Okay, well maybe we'll get back to that question today. Should we start off by a quick introduction?
Sure.
Why don't you go first?
Hello, I'm associate professor of economics here at George Mason University. I've been tenured for, I guess, almost 18 years now. And so I don't stay in my lane. And in the last 2.5 years, roughly, I've focused on culture. And so that's
Okay,
why I'm
cool.
especially interested to talk to Joe here.
Yep. And so I'm Joe Henrich. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. I'm actually keenly interested in economics and have spent some time as an economics professor at the University of British Columbia. And yeah, so my main focus is a interdisciplinary field called cultural evolution. And I guess that's at least, I guess that's our main topic today.
So I guess we should introduce the topic then.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
you must be
so
very practiced at summarizing the field.
for the audience, I think the best way to get into this is the field of cultural evolution begins by focusing on the individual as a learner. So the idea is that unlike other species, humans come into the world, we're heavily reliant on social learning. From a young age, actually before birth, we begin learning about our world and attending to other people. So we're really good at social learning and imitation. And so we begin acquiring ideas, beliefs, and values. And then where the cultural evolution part comes in is thinking about populations. So groups of learners, kids learn from parents, say, then learn from other individuals, grow up, learn from members of their community, and that gives rise to change over time. And because we've evolved genetically to be adaptive learners, keying in on people who, say, are more successful or more prestigious, using same similarity cues to figure out who to pay attention to, this leads to adaptive cultural evolution. So even outside of conscious awareness, this process will increasingly adapt us to different ecologies and different kinds of environments. And I think the fun part or the exciting part for me about this is the fact that you can go from individuals and how they learn, and you can scale up and think about populations changing over time, the emergence of things like social classes and ethnic groups, things like social norms, cooperation, those kinds of things are some of my main interests.
So you've described it very modestly there in a way that who could possibly object? But what I find most striking about it is its plausible scope. That is, it offers explanations for pretty much everything we're interested in explaining about human behavior. And say, as economists, we tend to say set aside preferences and try to explain choices and institutions in terms of, physical constraints and information and strategic constraints, while bracketing why people want things. But
Right.
cultural evolution isn't going to set that aside. It's going to go there and have a
Yeah.
story
And
for all of those things that we care deeply about, which we don't understand. We think we understand sometimes, but really don't.
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting feature of economics is that I think you tell me, but sometime in seems like in the 70s, economists decided that they can't account for preferences. And so preferences were taken as fixed and exogenous. And I think cultural evolution helps us understand changes in preferences over time and space, but also beliefs. So economists often assume beliefs are rational or well fitted to the environment. But if you're going to explain beliefs and taboos and religious beliefs and stuff, people in the exact same environment believe incredibly different things about the nature of the world. So look, the fact that we learn from other people helps us account for that. And then I actually think our information processing machinery inside of our heads, so how we process information, actually also varies due to cultural evolution.
And I've become persuaded that, in fact, most of human nature as we know it probably was the result of cultural evolution and much less the result of DNA evolution long ago, means a lot may have changed over the last 100,000 years, a lot more than you otherwise would have thought, and also that a lot more could be changing in the near future in terms of our nature. Now, standard natural selection, Darwinian selection, people have this love-hate relationship with it. And often the way that people make peace with it is they think, okay, sure, all those animals evolved with all their complicated DNA, but that's the slow process. And then humans are this new process that isn't, that old Darwinian process. And now we have, they often use the word culture, values, morality, etc. And they think of ourselves as an exception, you see, because of our parameters are so different from all the other animals, and they're comfortable with that way of setting aside evolution. But cultural evolution threatens to return us to a Darwinian world. And for example, with the idea of, say, social Darwinism, many people have really come to hate the very idea of thinking of ourselves very subject to natural selection, and that being an important thing for us to actually think about in terms of the choices we make in our world today.
Yeah. And I think that actually leads to a lot of bad policy choices. I mean, I teach a course on human nature at Harvard, and one of the threads running throughout the course is that if we get a better understanding of human nature, we can do better policy. But the idea that you're moving towards is that not only we are a cultural species, but culture has been shaping our genetic evolution, probably well back into our evolutionary history. So there's two ways that Darwinian natural selection plays a role here, two sort of avenues into it. The first is that rather than just saying, Shazam, 50,000 years ago, humans became cultural, genetic evolution stopped, and the rest is just culture and values and stuff like that. We say that we're cultural because natural selection has shaped our brains to make us really reliant on, interested in, and good at learning from other people. So we spontaneously learn ideas, beliefs, values, opinions, practices. We intuitively mimic each other's behavior, facial expressions. It's one of the ways we do engage in mind reading. So our minds are very much evolved by genetic evolution to be good at this cultural learning. So this means that any cultural explanation is ultimately anchored in genetic evolution. That the reason we're different from so many other species is this culture thing that itself is a cognitive adaptation.
So
Yeah.
in my world of economics and other related academic disciplines that consider policy, I think what I see is that when a policy question comes up, the immediate way people frame it is, what are my deep fundamental values? And then given my values, how do I evaluate this policy? And that framing doesn't have a place for cultural evolution so much, unless the policies were taking place over timescales such that cultural evolution might be changing things, which is rare. And so I think in most people's minds, cultural evolution just isn't relevant for these policy choices. And it then doesn't become very visible. So when people think about world issues or national issues or even the future or AI or whatever, this is the usual framing, I think, which is, what are my values? And then who are my enemies, say, who have the other values? And, who are my allies who are going to help me with my values? And then what policies will help me and my allies achieve our shared ends against our enemies? And when you think about cultural evolution,
that sounds like tribalism. So
well,
actually,
it is, of course,
evolutionary thinking.
But people think of that
gives
as
us insight
obvious,
into
of
that.
course, and they think of course, my values are my values. They're obvious. They were given to me, but there's just not, I wouldn't. Why would I question my values? For a lot of people, why would
Right.
I even think of questioning my values? Of course, they define who I am. If I had different values, I'd be a different person, and so they go from there. But to me, the shocking and exciting but disturbing thing about thinking about cultural evolution is to say, oh, my values were produced by this process. Do I trust this process? How random is this process? How much should I trust other people's results from this process, the values that they came up with, their things? Should I do a weighted average of mine and theirs, or some projection? I mean, how should I think about policy given that I no longer completely trust my values because I see how they were made? I see how the sausage was made.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, part of the sausage is you can do a good job of predicting someone's political beliefs by knowing their political beliefs of those in their social network or those
Indeed.
of where they grew up, the community they're in, whatnot.
So one of the questions I was thinking of asking here is,
Yeah.
why is it so hard to see culture? I wondered if you had other ways you'd frame that. I feel like I've known in the background about this idea of cultural evolution for a long time, but until recently, I just really couldn't take it seriously. And I'm pondering why didn't I? And you might have seen other people who reacted similarly.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I think this is just another way of saying what you said, but is that it's the fish and water problem. Is that, in my view, we're so deeply entrenched in culture that it's really hard for us to see what's not culture. So, and we should also define culture here a little bit more precisely for folks, is that in this way of thinking that I just laid out, culture is not exclusive to like cooking and dance rituals and things like that. It's anything that's socially learned, which brings things like technology as a type of culture. So if you go back into human evolutionary history before schools and stuff like that, you're a child, you're growing up in a hunter-gatherer society. Everything you learn about how to make bows and arrows, how to make fire, to do all, make medicines, to do technological stuff, you learn from the other members of your community. So it's culturally transmitted. If you're a farmer, 500 years ago, you're learning to plow, you're learning when to plant, how to fertilize, things like that. That's all transmitted culturally from other members of the group. So things that we would call human capital, technology, all of this stuff is culturally transmitted, and it's this just peculiarity of the way we sometimes divide up the world that makes that stuff not cultural.
So this is a key question I wanted to ask you, which is, there's this broad, inclusive concept of culture that people in your field use, and then elsewhere, say in the cultural section of the newspaper, there's a more narrow concept of the word culture. And a key question is that just an accidental two independent concepts using the same word, or is there actual a relationship? Are the topics that are called culture more narrowly actually more potent or influential in cultural evolution than other sorts of factors that we don't use the word culture for?
So my only reaction to this, and without having focused on it or studied it, is the stuff that's in the newspaper called culture is the stuff that changes quickly enough so that it can change in the course of one lifetime or even faster than that. So fashion trends, clearly fashion trends are cultural, right? We used to wear neckties, and so for a while they were thin, and then they were thick, and the same thing with famously studies of the height of women's dresses or something like that changed over time. So, that stuff is changing quickly. So they're calling it culture because it's doing it that way. But lots of other things like, economic practices and motivations and religious beliefs. I mean, most people would agree that religion is cultural, but that doesn't get put in the culture section of the newspaper, which
It
who are the
actually
hot
does in
gods
some
these
places,
days?
yes.
Oh, does it? Okay.
So religion is often seen as part of culture, yes.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Good.
but I would say, yes, fashion shows up in the culture sections. Obviously,
Food.
entertainment, often clothes, food, museums are culture, etc. And so museums don't change very fast, but these other elements do change fast. But I think another common element is that they are sort of coordination shared points. That is,
Mm,
the thin ties are things that we share as a coordination point. And so it's less free for individual choice. That is, the things
mm.
that show up in culture are more about things that we today or in this place share as a community and are trying to coordinate on what we share.
Right,
And
right.
then that counts more as culture. The word culture is more given to things you can vary as a group than things you would just vary individually without much feedback from the group.
Yep. Yeah. So you're saying it's more emphasis on identity markers or something. So
Or
food,
norms
food.
or institutions. So
Okay.
I know you're interested in thinking about or talking here about what is a norm or institution in the context of culture. And we might say to some degree, they are ways we coordinate on a shared
Right. Right.
structure
Right.
rather than
Sure.
having features that we can vary individually.
Yeah. So just to bring the audience in on this, so uh, just kind of building the standard cultural evolutionary theory, once you're learning from each other, it turns out that groups can end up with things that are called social norms. And social norms are where you have a shared behavior, like, say, a food taboo. And you've also transmitted the standards for judging behavior around that. So, for example, there can be certain foods you're not supposed to eat, and people who eat that food are bad. And so you don't associate with them, or maybe they're not part of the group anymore. There can be all kinds of ways to sanction the norm violator. And so that creates this self-reinforcing stable equilibria. And of course, different societies have lots of different norms, high levels of variability in the contents of norms. but they're always stabilized in some way where a norm violation is considered bad. And so then some norms, what we've been talking about, are norms that are particularly salient. So, I mean, I use food taboos as an example because lots of societies kind of mark themselves off by which foods they eat, when they eat it, and which ones you're not allowed to eat. And the guys next door do eat those foods, that sort of thing.
So we economists tend to build a lot on game theory. And in game theoretic terms, this is the difference between equilibria and maybe individual choices. That is, a
Right,
norm
exactly.
is an equilibria in some set of people. That is, we could have had a different equilibria, but we have a shared equilibria. And it seems like natural selection of shared equilibria structures is a little different than natural selection of individual variations. Say the analogy might be species in DNA evolution. That is, species have to share some things in common in order to be able to mate with each other. And there are some things that can vary within a species without problem because those things don't define the species, like how long your claws are or something. And then there are features closer to the mating system where the whole species would have to change that together. And so we have in DNA evolution the distinction between evolution within species and evolution of species, which is an example of multiple levels of selection.
Yeah. Just building on that, so, different societies end up with these different norms, and then you can move up to a higher level within this cultural hierarchy and where you have whole groups or societies, communities competing because they have a set of shared norms, everybody's converged on those, and somebody else is doing it differently. And then the question is who wins in some sort of competitive interaction? And this could be something dangerous like warfare, combat, conflict, raiding, or this could be something not so dangerous like copying. So a more successful group gets copied, and that can cause norms to flow from one group to another.
I think a nice concrete example in culture, at least for an economist, is corporate culture. Firms are units that are selected together as a unit. The firm grows or dies as a unit to a large degree. And then different corporations have different cultures inside the corporation. And then corporations are competing with their corporate cultures. But you, as a member of a particular corporation, need to follow the culture of your corporation. You don't have that much freedom to deviate there. But still, there's going to be evolution at these two scales, uh,
Yep.
within and between.
And then there's sociologists and people working in organizational behavior have documented, clear, easy to measure things like the spread of certain corporate strategies or, golden parachute spread, kind of epidemically amongst corporations. And some of these practices could be something like matrix management was another one. And these things spread when successful corporations did them. And then the question is, some of them maybe helped promote that success, and then some of them were probably useless baggage. The learners didn't know which was which, and so copied several.
So I don't know if you've heard about this before, but we have some numerical metrics of the relative importance of within and between evolution, both for species and for corporate cultures. That is, if we look back at life on Earth and we ask, where did it come from? There are two kinds of places life could have come from. It could have come from large integrated habitats like areas of the ocean, or small fragmented habitats like in rainforests and rivers and coral reefs. And in the fragmented habitats, species are smaller, their scope is smaller. And so there's less scope for evolution within a species because each species doesn't have as many places to, produce an innovation and have it spread to the rest. But there's more scope for innovation of species because there are more species. And so that's a trade-off. That is, fragmented habitats have more evolution of species, less evolution within species. Large habitats have the opposite. So if we ask, where does most life come from? It says, well, actually, the fragmented habitats have had more successful descendants, suggesting that evolution of species matters more. And a similar thing seems to happen in industries. You have fragmented industries versus larger chunked industries. And fragmented industries have less scope for innovation to spread within a firm before it hits the boundary of the firm. And it's harder to spread innovations across the boundary of a firm, just like with species. But more innovation of the different corporate cultures that are available. And in fact, fragmented industries do also seem to be more innovative overall.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
that's very
that
interesting.
suggests that this higher level isn't just an interesting, small, you know, thing to mention as a variation on the more important basic thing. It may, in fact, be where more of the action is.
Yeah, and I think the multi-level framework can help with intuition surrounding the role of competition in human sociality. So the multi-level framework naturally partitions the competition, as you've been saying, to within group versus between group. So corporations, any kind of group can suffer individuals within the group competing and engaging in cutthroat zero-sum competition to see who gets the highest salary and, undermining each other to get better in their performance rankings. But if you have groups competing, then that groups that are able to create more internal harmony and mitigate some of that within group competition are going to be able to succeed in the intergroup competition. And one of my favorite papers was actually done by a group of economists from the University of British Columbia. Patrick Francois is among the authors. They look at the banking deregulation in the United States from the late 60s up to Glass-Steagall in 1992. And what they show is as the banking system is deregulated in different states at different times, you get an uptick in the amount of competitions among firms because capital enters the system, there's more new entries into the system, more inter-firm competition. And then what they do is they look at the trust of people in those places. And you get the trust begins going up. It continues going up for about 16 years when the data set ends, because the intergroup competition is driving up this trust among individuals. Whereas when you don't have very much intergroup competition, it drives the trust down because people are, selfish, the usual free rider selfishness problems.
So I'm especially interested in talking with you about major changes in human culture and society over the last few centuries. But certainly one of them right here is that we have greatly increased the scale of organizations and the scope of their functions. That is, say, particular functions the government does has moved up from the neighborhood to the city to the state to the national level, and average size of corporations and nonprofits has gotten a little larger. And that just suggests that we've just gotten much better over the last few centuries at managing these internal conflicts in order to allow larger organizations to function. And that's a triumph of humanity over the last few centuries.
Yeah. And I think that this approach allows you to think about, well, how is that possible? How do you get big groups together? It's not just that there's a company with 1,000 people who get in a room together and discuss how to proceed. That probably wouldn't work. Instead, you have organizational forms and hierarchies, and nobody's quite sure what all these things do. I mean, some of them are intuitive, some aren't. But you can think of it as one giant experiment where, unsuccessful groups, whatever kind they are, whether they're medieval guilds or medieval towns or modern corporations or modern nation states, are experimenting with all different configurations. And, history is a story of winners and losers and who puts together the more effective combination of institutional traits that allows this higher level of cooperation.
So, over the last few centuries, other big trends are that we've greatly increased the degree of talk and trade and travel across long distances. And that plausibly has been homogenizing or integrating cultures. That is, cultures that could have been quite distinct and different have become more similar as they've had more contact and trade and travel and integration. But that suggests that maybe like the big ocean areas, rather than small fragmented, rainforests, that we are now having less cultural variety, at least on the largest scales, compared to what we had a few centuries ago. And that we're now more moving into the regime of being these large integrated habitats that will have more innovation within the habitat, but less innovation of the things they share in common.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. I'd be interested in putting together historical data on that. So it's definitely the case that there's interconnections among societies now, and lots of traits have spread, like formal schooling or something has spread globally. Um, the nation state basic setup has spread globally. Democracy is very popular. I mean, even speaking English is 1 in 6 people in the world speak some English. So, these massive chains, but at the same time, we're getting the creation of new forms as different institutions recombine. So somewhere like Japan has adopted lots of Western institutions, but as those institutions have integrated with traditional Japanese way of doing things, you're getting a new third thing that is neither the Western institutions from which they came, nor the traditional thing that was Japan before the inflow of these Western institutions like schools and universities, ways of governing. So there is a production of novelty. How that all sorts out in the longer run is unclear. So
But that's the sort of novelty for which you're allowed to vary it. That is, Japanese companies can sort of say, let's copy this old Japanese company and this US company and make our company some combination of those two. And the world doesn't punish that. There aren't strong norms that would prohibit those sorts of variations. But to the extent we share norms on larger scales, then we would have less variation in those norms. And that could produce less cultural evolution. So
right.
Concretely, the world looks different in many ways, but if below the surface, there's a lot of homogeneity that's appeared in the world over the last few centuries. So say if you look at fertility trends, they look surprisingly correlated across the world. If you looked at, say, pandemic policy and COVID, it was much less variation than you might have expected from 150 independent experiments. If you look at other areas of regulation, nuclear power, medical experiments, air flight, banking, etc., there's just a lot of correlation in those policies around the world, suggesting that, in fact, there's less variation than you might have thought merely giving the numbers, which makes me more worried. So an anecdote that I guess you could check: when I meet, high quality people, young people around the world, that you must meet a lot of there at Harvard, they present themselves in the following two ways. If you say, where are you from? And they say Brazil, and you say, what should the world think about people from Brazil? They will defend their place. They will say, yes, we are different in this way. Maybe we're passionate or something, but they will say that's a thing the world should value. The world should value this thing that my place has. And they are, willing to endorse it and be proud of it. But the other thing to make clear is that they personally have no distinguishing features that would all cause any trouble for them to work smoothly in an international organization. They are sort of generic world elites themselves,
Right.
even if they celebrate the people they came from. So
Yep.
I see much more cultural homogeneity among elites worldwide. And that is concerning from the point of view of this cultural variety point.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It's not clear what one does about that. But
Well,
I,
first,
I, I
diagnosing problems.
yeah,
First
yeah. No,
diagnose,
I'm
then
with you.
prognose. But yes.
I'm with you. Yeah. No, that's very interesting.
Well, actually, to push the point, so here's a mathematical metaphor for natural selection. Tell me whether it's reasonable. There's a high-dimensional space of possibilities. In this space, there's a small adaptive region. It may have a strange shape, but it's small compared to the big space. It's high-dimensional space. There's a set of points that are in the space. Some of them are in the region or close to the region, others far away. The points in the region or close to it grow and split. Ones far away shrink and die. And the task of natural selection, first task, is just to prevent things from getting worse. So this cloud needs to track this region. So as the region moves, the cloud needs to go with it. And that requires 4 parameters to be in a decent regime. One is the number of points. The more points you have, the easier it is to track the region. Another is the selection pressure. How strongly is the favoring of the points in the region versus the one out the region? A third is how fast this region moves. Faster it moves, the harder it is to track. And the fourth is how randomly do these points just move independent of the rest of this process. So those are 4 parameters that all need to be, if you take them to one extreme, it looks like this works. You take them to the other extreme, it looks like it doesn't. So it's like, say, driving a car. There's a set of parameters in driving a car. If they're in the right regime, you'll stay on the road. If they go bad, you'll go off the road. So this process could fail to track this adaptive region. If there wasn't enough variety, the selection pressure was too low, the points wiggled too much randomly, or the region itself moved too fast. away
Right.
from the rest of the points.
And another possibility is that there's multiple of those attractive regions, right?
Right, right.
In
So
other parts of the
there would be
space,
many of
there's
them,
other.
perhaps, but they would still be a small percentage of the volume.
Yes,
Then the
exactly.
task would be for the cloud to track some of them.
Right, and you could also get stuck on a one that's not so good.
Right, but at least that wouldn't be a catastrophic failure. The worst case catastrophic failure would just be to lose any of these regions,
Sure.
and then the points all die, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, over the last 3 centuries, say, if we look at sort of global scale macro culture parameters, first, 3 centuries ago, we had roughly 100,000 of peasant cultures, each which were relatively autonomous and self-sufficient. And that was a high variety. We had strong selection pressures because they were poor, near the edge of survival. We had slow rates of change because, say, the world economy doubled roughly every 1,000 years. And then they were all very conservative. They didn't want to change very much, right? They tried not to change much. And now in the last few centuries, we first merged peasant cultures into nation states, and then nations now into a world elite monoculture at least. So variety is way down. Selection pressures are down because these larger remaining cultures are not being killed off by pandemics, wars, or famines anymore. The rate of change of the environment that they need to track is much faster. That is, the world economy doubles roughly every 15 to 20 years now rather than every 1,000 years. So that's a much faster rate at which the adaptive region moves to track. And finally, instead of being conservative cultures, eager, trying not to change, we have flipped to being eager to change. Cultural activists, especially driven by youth movements, are looking for causes that they want to join to purposely cause cultural change,
Okay.
which mostly doesn't seem to track the adaptive factors. So these are 4 ways in which key parameters of the process seem to have gone bad over the last few centuries. So,
Right.
is that a reasonable summary, or am I missing something important?
Well, that all sounds fine. Although one thing to keep in mind is as this the movement of our mysterious center point will create shocks, right? So it'll create, and those shocks actually have a psychological effect, which cause people to be tighter on social norms and less willing to change. So populations that get more shocked or
Right.
stickier.
Well,
So
that makes it all the
that's
more
going to
striking.
and
we
of
we have
course,
been suffering this shock. Clearly, future shock was a famous, Toffler phrase from half a century ago. But yeah, the world is changing very rapidly, but we've decided that we're eager for that. So that was the modernization switch. So, somewhere around 1900 or so in the West, like if you look at the novel Middlemarch, it's a world of rapidly changing context of technology, but the characters don't think their culture is changing. They feel that their culture is very stable, and that's how they want it. And then you go, later on to, say, Man Without Qualities, and you have a world, not only the world is changing, but the people in it are eager to cause change. They are wondering what causes to join and what,
right.
things to do. And so they are not shell-shocked by change. They are energized and eager to cause cultural change.
Well, I'm just talking about the data showing that people are less inclined to change. So I can
All else
we
equal,
can
maybe.
go through.
But we have this, and for the last century or so, most elites have been eager to cause cultural change. That is, people have been trying to join movements and join,
Right.
coordination
Well,
in order
that
to
was
cause
the
change.
that was the other thing, though. I mean, so you and I always seem to talk about fertility, and there's not going to be so many young people because of the fertility. So less of those crazy young people to want to try to do change.
Well, so I got this data from ChatGPT, so we'll give it that caution. But what I asked it to do is to find 100 conflicts between the young and the old that were at least 50 years old, right?
Okay.
In history, okay? Where the young and the old had some cultural conflict. And I asked it to score eventually who won in this conflict. And it told me that out of the 100, 96 times the young people won, 1 time the elderly won, and 3 times it was a tie. So that
Okay.
quite consistently, the young people, now this is selection effect for it, like anytime the youth stuck with the cause for long enough that it showed up in, historical discussions of it or
Right.
something, right?
Right.
But still, if the young people reach a certain threshold of commitment to some sort of cultural change and they're willing to stick with it, they eventually win.
Although that's all going to be data from the period
When there were more
the
young people.
population. Yeah. So the pyramid's reversed now, right? So the
Well, maybe,
older
but
people
if
have
we
the
look in the
numbers.
last 20 years, most of the large cultural changes in the last 20 years have been driven by youth movements.
Yeah. Although there's a pushback now, right?
So maybe that'll change.
Yeah.
But it does seem like the young people have an advantage in these sorts of cultural conflicts. They are
Oh
just
yeah,
more
yeah. Well,
willing
the
to,
fact that they don't die so quickly.
yes, but also they have more energy. They're more willing to come together into a
Yeah,
movement that's beyond themselves. They less
of course,
bicker
of
about who
course.
controls it.
Yep.
And, they get more inspired, more
Yeah,
energized.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so,
Yeah, these are all good cultural evolutionary hypotheses.
right. But the story of what the parameters I just told me the story 3 centuries ago, the parameters look good for cultural evolution. Now the parameters look bad. The prediction would be that this process is no longer controlling very well. The
Right.
car's going to
The
drive
only
off the road.
there's a small terminological thing going. So for me, cultural evolution isn't ever good or bad. It just is. And societies collapse.
Yeah,
Sometimes there's wars, pathogens.
sure.
That's all cultural evolution.
Yes.
If you're talking about improving our normative versions of what a good world is, low infant mortality, longevity, lots of food, economic growth, then that's fine. Those are going to go up and down. Societies always collapse, right?
So we economists have a long history. I think compared to most social scientists, we are the most willing to be normative about recommending policy changes because
Right.
we have a shared structure by which we evaluate them called economic efficiency. And so we do both. We make sure to separate positive analysis of what the world is and could be from normative analysis, but we go there with the normative. We say
Yep.
this
Yep.
policy looks better than that. And that's one of the reasons I think the world has more demand for economists. We have recommendations about what to do.
Right.
So that's
But
where I
I
worry
guess
that
I was earlier. You said first diagnosis, and then, but so I guess I'm just saying that all of these things are amenable to cultural evolutionary analysis, whether the world is getting better or not as bad. And the other
right,
thing about societal collapse, obviously. None of us in our lives want societal collapse because that's usually really bad. But that will mean there's lots of small disconnected communities because larger scale
right,
things break
absolutely,
apart. And so. So the,
right.
the
So
variation will get restored if I mean in the long
sure,
run.
but I mean, let's pause on this because this is really important. I think, right? Cultural evolution as a discipline, I believe, has felt a little embattled and perhaps not getting sufficient respect, and therefore has been trying to go out of its way to be, carefully separate their positive from any normative analysis. And
Right,
they
right.
were trying really hard to be scientific in that way, and that's all commendable. But when I take it seriously from an economics background, I want to then go to the next step and say, well, let's analyze the policy consequences of this
Yeah, that's good. We
as
like
a
that.
person who lives in that world and cares about what happens.
Yeah,
I
that's good.
get that you want to put on a different hat though, right?
Right,
Take
right.
off the scientist hat so people don't, that isn't polluted by the other things you do. It might get more pushback or whatever. But to me, that's exactly why cultural evolution is so important, drawn my attention, is because it seems to have such large dramatic policy implications.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's fine. I was just clarifying the cultural evolution thing, and it was just, as I said, it's just a bit of a semantic issue. Like it's still cultural evolution, even if we're losing
Sure,
technology and the population's shrinking and economic
absolutely.
growth has been negative for 3 centuries. And
But take the fact that in history, civilization seems to rise and fall, right? That that
that's
seems
for
to be a
sure.
rough pattern, rise and fall of civilizations, right? It seems like on the basis of that, if you think in cultural evolution terms, you have to say, well, the fall period, something was worse than in the rise period. Like
Right, right,
that wherever it was in the space of possible cultural parameters, that wasn't such a good place because
right.
otherwise it would be rising instead of falling. Which,
Right. So when historians, people like Peter Turchin have done this, they're looking at things like the size, whether is the population growing? Does it seem to be producing new and flourishing technologies? Is there a robust trade amongst distant regions? That sort of thing.
right. But the point is, if we think of these as cultures and sitting in some place in cultural space, and we think that a healthy culture would on average grow more than shrink, I mean, obviously there's also going to be lots of random factors, then this suggests that later on in empires, their culture is just less healthy from a cultural evolution adaptiveness standard than earlier on in the empire.
That's right. So, so that's another measure, though, because you could say the measure of these societies is how are they doing in intergroup competition? Uh,
Sure.
and if you
But
start
right,
losing
but the
all the
fall seems
time,
to be
then
falling on most of these dimensions. Not only do they fall in
right,
population, they fall in military strength, they fall in cultural influence, they fall in a wide range of dimensions, right?
yeah, that's right.
So it
I
looks
agree with
like
that.
they're just worse.
Yep.
So that
Well,
suggests that it's quite possible for a particular culture to get worse for a time, even if cultural evolution in the long run is overall in charge in determining long-term results,
hmm.
which then can be a worry for us. Could we also get worse for a while and
Yeah,
then
I don't.
decline in influence and, on the future, and because we are following the same trajectory these other civilizations did by somehow going from better to worse in some
Right,
predictable pattern.
right. So I guess the policy questions that you're interested in are how do we um, stay away from the fall as long as possible?
Right. That is, we want to diagnose first what's causing our fall, if there
Right,
is, and then ask what levers could we have?
right, right,
Or maybe if fall looks inevitable, how can we bail on this culture and
right,
find the winners and join them?
right, right. What was that book by Isaac Asimov, Foundation?
Right.
So psychohistory was all about
Exactly.
trying to
Harry
mitigate the
Seldon.
fall, right? Harry
Exactly.
Seldon was trying to mitigate the fall. So we're
So
basically trying to do Harry Seldon's business.
when I ask ChatGPT what science fiction character I most like, I get Harry Seldon.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So I guess it knows about my thinking about these issues.
Oh,
But
excellent.
yeah, so um, I would take the analogy that the Christians took over the Roman Empire by doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries, standard estimate. And there are now insular fertile subcultures like the Amish and Haredim who have been doubling every 20 years for a while, the Amish for a century or over a century. And therefore, one plausible scenario is they just keep growing like the Christians did and eventually
Yeah.
come to dominate.
Yeah.
And then, like from the
But that's a
cultural,
good idea of that there's always insulated groups, right? So
yes, it's good for
and
humanity as a whole, absolutely. That is,
we'll all be
if we
Amish.
decided to say, oh, we're jealous of them, let's go crush them so they can't beat us, well, that would risk humanity much more. So, yes,
That's
having
right.
those
That's
as
right.
insurance is good. But now, like, if you were on say, a ship heading for an iceberg, the two options you have really are to try to get the whole ship to turn or to get off on lifeboats. So
Right.
here you could think of, we're in this shared civilization that if it's in decline, if you can't prevent the decline, maybe you should try to transfer to lifeboats, like
Right.
these small insular fertile groups, or try to form a new one.
Right.
But
Well, I guess there's the tech billionaires who have the secret place in New Zealand,
that's not
where
going to
they're.
make a growing
That's not going
civilization.
to
It's
matter.
just a
No, it's
compound.
just going to be some guy held up.
They're going to have some servants as long as they can afford them, and then they'll go away, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So,
Okay. So what's the our lifeboat? Or are you interested in the lifeboat size? You want to save the civilization, right?
I would rather turn the whole ship. Yes.
Okay.
But does seem like a really tough challenge. But I at least want to think through the various options. So, like, one option is there are these two levels, the things we share and the things we can vary within. If you could move that boundary, take things that we now do via shared norms and allow them to vary, say, to let capitalism take over and run them, well, that might allow more competitive pressures and selection processes to happen
Okay.
on things, right? So,
I like those kinds of ideas. Can you be more specific? So how do we
well,
create more variation and selection?
say if we wanted more fertility, we could just create for-profit orphanages where they can sell the kids when they grow them, and then of course capitalists would find ways to grow lots of kids, right? I mean, that's nobody much likes that idea, but
Yeah, I'm kind of
that's
skeptical of that one.
yes, of course. Another would be just for-profit governments. In fact, governments who cared about the health of their culture within their scope, if they were for-profit, they might have stronger motives to go try to diagnose and fix whatever cultural problems their
Okay. So
government
this would
scope
be
had.
like charter cities, but the
Right, exactly.
for-profit
Larger
model.
scales, yes.
Okay.
Well, in fact, the most popular charter cities are for-profit,
Yeah,
actually,
I mean,
today. So
okay, so that experiment's underway.
on a very small scale, but the question is,
Okay.
could it grow and
Could it
scale up
could
to
you-
be
could you
enough?
Scale it up?
But those are the
Well,
kinds of things to think
I
about.
think for the audience, we should put an idea out there, which I think you and I agree on, which is that a lot of times the institutions that humans have constructed, which often have religious and ritual elements, and they have hidden structure. I've argued that monogamous marriage is important, which is not intuitive to a lot of people. So what makes a successful institution with all these different parts is really hard for us to design.
Agreed.
I think we're bad at designing institutions, and I could cite some experimental evidence. But so what we need is a variation selection system where we let lots of different people or groups try to essentially design institutions. So creating a charter city is an experiment. It's a how are we going to do everything that the city needs to do? And you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but each time you create a city or create a community or a government or an organization, it's an experiment, and you can learn a little bit, figure out which bits work, or just try random recombination
Right.
and try to improve things that way.
And
So
that's
that's in
what
the background to here is how do we build the better institutions?
and that's what say does so disturbing about say the global coordination of pandemic response is there were very few experiments that deviated from the overall world consensus of what to do. And that's disturbing about many other areas of regulation. We're not actually taking advantage of having a large world of different independent polities because they correlate so strongly on their policy choices. And so
Yeah.
that's
The
part of the
as a
problem is
as
if
an
you
interesting
deviated, you get punished.
Yeah.
So
No, I think you're making a great point here, which one of the areas, if you kind of look across history and say, where have things really flourished from time to time, you often find it's in these collections of city states, whether you're talking about Mayan city states or Greek city states or Italian city states, because each city is doing its own thing. It's independent, but it's also learning from the other cities, right? And they're competing. So there's intergroup competition, but there's independent choices. There's different cultures going on. So it's good to have this framework in mind.
I mean, several warnings. So one warning is if you look at corporate cultures, CEOs actually have a lot of power and incentive to fix corporate cultures. So if you ask if you put somebody in charge with strong incentives to fix a cultural problem, how well can they do? Well, what CEOs often do is they have cultural change initiatives where they pay a lot of money consultants and do a lot of things to try to move their culture in the direction they intend. And apparently 2/3 of the time they agree they fail. So even a CEO who can fire anybody and instruct anybody in what to do and has all these really strong financial incentives to make that corporate culture go well, still they go bad. And that's possibly the main reason firms die. Basically firms only last on the S&P 500 for about 20 years on average. So they just really appear and go away relatively quickly. And every CEO on that list knows that fact. And they don't want their firm to die. And they have strong powers, but they still fail to be able to do that. So that suggests it's just really hard, even if
It's
you have
hard.
the power and incentives to actually manage a culture.
Right. And that's why having a lot of competing firms is important because each of those CEOs is, just turning a bunch of dials. And, I think the best approximation would be random. Sometimes we have the wrong intuition. So the things we think that will help are actually the opposite of what would help. So they might even be turning the dials in a way that tends to kill the corporations. But if you have a lot of them, somebody's going to turn the dials the right way, right? So that's the advantage of the variation and selection system.
So there's a Harvard law professor named of Stuntz, I think, who died after publishing his last book, maybe 20 years ago. He wrote this big book about the history of law in the United States. And he said, at the beginning of the United States, the basic legal framework pretty much allowed any local county to have whatever law they wanted. There was very little central control over U.S. law. But then over the last 2.5 centuries, what happened was that there were these moral crusades like slavery or prostitution or alcohol or drugs. And in each crusade, there was a large enough group of people in the world who said, look, we can't allow anybody to deviate from this shared consensus on this key point. And then Supreme Court ruled on that. And slowly over time, we've had a lot more constraints on what any one county can do for their laws.
Right.
And
Right.
so that's this warning about the city-state model. In some sense, the US was a city-state model, except you had this shared structure that was only there for some rare purposes, but still over time it acquired the power and acted to reduce variety. And so that's a key problem in our world. So as an example, the only country in the world that allows organ sales to any substantial degree is Iran. And when bioethicists meet around the world, they talk about how can we get Iran to stop being the deviant country that doesn't do the right thing about organ sales. And that's a key problem with cultural variety in the world. It's not just having some place that could do it different, there are strong global conformity pressures.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the sort of decline in the variation occurred between counties within states as state governments took more power, and then of course between states as the federal government took more power. So there's increased conformity all the way up as power moved up the chain. Um, yeah, no, so I think we need more local experiments, more cities
Right.
with the ability to do things rather differently.
So there is this community that likes the idea of what they call multiculturalism. And that's a resource here because they at least think they want this sort of variety to increase. But I think if you dig a little farther, what it turns out what people like is varieties in maybe language, food, clothes, music, holidays, building styles. But they don't like variety in attitudes toward gender equality, war, you know, um,
Right.
spanking children,
Right.
all those sorts of
Marriage,
things.
marriage, like whether you can have
Exactly.
polygyny.
So, right. So the world doesn't want variety in those sorts of deeper cultural elements. So I think what they really want is more of a shallow multiculturalism. There was a famous essay called it boutique multiculturalism from the 80s, I believe. But, and that's a key problem is with the shallow multiculturalism, people don't quite notice just how much homogeneity we have.
Right, right. So this is your idea about what's on the fashion page is all the signaling stuff. So you're saying that multiculturalism is about which foods you eat, which languages you can speak, whether you can wear your traditional dress.
Star Wars versus Star
It's
Trek.
not any of the stuff that is sort of deeply affects social life and economic
Right.
outcomes.
And in fact, when people see that sort of variety, they try to crush it.
Hmm.
They really want to, call it out and say that we shouldn't allow, other parents to raise their children in this way, say that we would think doesn't give those children all the opportunities we would think children should get, etc.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. I think we're in crazy amounts of agreement here. We've got to find something we disagree on.
So I've been thinking about this for the last 2 years now, sort of what we could possibly do, because it just seems like a really hard problem driven by some really fundamental pressures that we like, right? Like nobody wants to go back to 300 years ago levels of war deaths or
Right.
poverty deaths or pandemics, right?
Or infant mortality, yeah.
Right.
So
That would be a way to reduce and increase selection pressures, but come on. And nobody really wants to reduce the degree of integration of the world in terms of talk, travel, and trade. We don't want to block ourselves off into isolated groups. That's pretty strong preference. So what else do we have? Like I said, we could make some things more capitalist, but that is something people mostly don't like.
well, there are the charter cities, and periodically people experiment with schooling, trying different schooling systems.
So I
Yeah.
have my favorite long shot solution.
Okay.
It's because I happen to be the inventor of a form of government that promises to be much more competent at
Okay.
achieving its given goals. So I call it futarchy, slogan, vote on values, bet on beliefs. We don't actually have to talk about how it works, because the idea is just if we had a more competent form of government of the form that you give it a goal and it achieves that goal, an after the fact measurable goal, is there a way to use that to overcome this problem?
Okay.
And so the question is, at the moment, so one generic solution to any problem, as you know, is just to tell government, hey, we have a problem, please fix it. Thank you very much. And that often doesn't work, as you know, because our forms of government aren't especially competent. They aren't actually that able to solve problems that you give them, and we aren't actually able to hold them to account very well to actually do that. But if you had a mechanism that was very accountable and competent, where you could say, this is what we want, just do it, then the question is, could you give it the problem of let's avoid civilization collapse? And then it would just do it. Now, first, it's a big ask to even have such a mechanism. So I'll just grant that I agree that I'm optimistic about what I've invented actually working. And there are people who are now experimenting. I invented it 26 years ago, or actually almost 30 years ago now. But people are now in the last few years doing some experiments in mainly crypto and other organizations to try it out. And so we'll see how well it works. It's worked well so far. But the point is, I think if we gave a government the goal of just prevent civilization collapse, as measured by GDP or population or something like that, I think that wouldn't actually work, because as soon as it started to ask sacrifices of us, which it would somehow in service of this goal, we'd go, hell with that, and change its goal.
Well, it wouldn't even necessarily know what to do.
Well, that's the whole point of it being competent. This is a mechanism that's competent enough to figure out what to do.
I see.
And that's
well,
the claim.
that sounds
it's
like
actually
a fantasy.
that. Well, I can show you data about that. And I think I could even convince you with a plausibility argument that it has that capability. But here I'm just saying, even if we had that, how would we use it? And here it suggests, if we set the goal, if we don't really believe in the goal, we're not going to stick with it. See, the reason civilization decline is because we like what we're doing, right? Given our culture, our behavior is roughly what we want to do, and it's getting us the local ends that we want.
It's
right?
like the budget deficit, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So people may not just care that much about the long-term trajectory of civilization enough to sacrifice now for it.
Right, because there's now and the future is kind of
exactly.
far.
But the question is, so I did roughly a few years ago, studying the sacred, and people do want to have a sacred in their lives, and they are willing to sacrifice for it, and they are in fact ashamed to abandon their pursuit of the sacred. And so the sacred is basically a thing that binds people together, and that's an ancient human evolved function. Culture gave human the sacred so that groups could bind themselves together around a shared vision of who they are and what they value. And if we could pick a shared vision of who we are and what we value that happened to be inconsistent with civilization collapse, and we could give that goal to a competent form of government, well, then I'd have more hope. So, for example, I did some polls on what could count here, and one of them was, when do 1 million people live in space? Apparently, a lot of people think of space colonization as a sacred venture that they could get behind, that they really feel binds them together. And plausibly, civilization decline over the next few centuries would prevent that from happening. And therefore, a competent form of government that was assigned the task, make sure we get to that point as soon as possible, would in fact achieve it. And when it asked for sacrifices from us, in the name of that goal that we didn't like, we would be proud to be making sacrifices for our sacred goal. So now, physical immortality is another goal like that. Plausibly, within the next few centuries, if we kept working at it, we could actually make bodies like yours and mine physically immortal, at least, factor of 10 or something longer lifespans. And then that's a goal some people think we can get behind. And then civilization collapse would get in the way of that goal. It would delay it, no doubt. So, hey, that could work. So that's my best scenario. But you can see this is a long shot on several counts, which means I'm pretty pessimistic. Yes, I'm going to say, oh, this looks bad.
Right. Well, I mean, there's just so many ways for civilization to end. So, yeah. So maybe we should talk about some of the other interesting things on our list.
Please. You pick.
Well, so one idea that's relevant to this whole discussion, and I think this will bring in some of your interest in fertility, would be the concept within cultural evolution of the collective brain. So typically, or it's a common notion that a lot of great ideas and inventions are produced by heroic inventors who, by virtue of their individual brilliance or personal perseverance, are able to think really hard, often in a room by themselves. I'm imagining Isaac Newton at Cambridge, and then burst forth some genius. But when you look at these cases, and when you look at the origins of creativity, whether you look at great patents or just the production of famous creative people, it seems that it depends on societal factors. And so larger populations produce more creativity.
Absolutely.
When populations are more interconnected, so more trust among individuals, so ideas flow, better transportation, whether it's the Grand Canal or the Roman roads or postal services. You can go from there, telephones, telegraphs. That's going to create more flow of ideas. Books, literacy can also fulfill that. And then cognitive diversity. So different minds with different ideas offer more opportunity for recombination.
And I know you just published a paper on that in the last few weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm working on it all the time. Working on it all the time. So I'm writing a book on this. So, but I think this strikes me. You're mentioning policymakers who, I try to stay on my lane mostly. But this seems like if you're a mayor and you want to know how to increase co- uh, creativity in your city, hiring a bunch of geniuses is not going to probably do it. What you need to do is create that flow of ideas among diverse minds. And there's all kinds of ways you can do that. Simple things like a well-functioning road system with not that much traffic. There's good evidence showing that that works. Having high-speed rail between cities so people can very quickly get from one city to another to have a face-to-face meeting. That seems to be important. At least it has been historically. I mean, there's always a question of the latest technology and what role that might play. But
So the way you were just telling the story fits into a standard trope, which is to focus on invention over diffusion. So innovation is the combination of the two. Something needs to be invented and then it needs to diffuse to other places. And in fact, it looks like when we look at variations in innovation, it's much more about variations in diffusion than it is about variations in invention. Even just over the history of humanity, like the difference of humans versus other animals is the diffusion through culture as opposed to the invention through culture. That is, diffusion is more changed by culture than invention is. And then the arrival of farming through long-distance trading and communication networks allowed diffusion to happen more rapidly with farming, and then specialized expert networks allowed more rapid and better specialized diffusion through in the modern industrial era. And so, but often we celebrate inventions. We have these, movies and biopics about the great inventor, and we don't talk so much about the diffusion. And in fact, we
yeah,
often have the not invented here idea that we only want the inventor here, not the diffuser.
the diffuser, right?
Somebody,
And embedded among the, I don't really like that distinction that much because I think that most inventions are actually recombinations, which means they're
yeah,
the coming
right.
together of two different diffusions. I wanted to really get into this, so I did a lot of reading about Einstein's special relativity paper in 1905, and there's about 4 ideas in that paper. The notion of space time and speed of light being constant. And none of those were Einstein's ideas. They were all circulating. And in fact, we know that Einstein used to get together with his buddies in a kind of reading and journal club. And we know what was on their reading list. And they actually read the books that contained all of these ideas in the course of the time, the prior to Einstein writing his papers. So he had not only encountered, but argued with his friends about these different ideas. And then, of course, he was the one who put it together. But a guy named Poincaré also put these ideas together. He just didn't have quite a youthful exuberance and put it together in such a bold way. He kind of thought there was a bit of a fudge factor in his math rather than saying, actually, the universe is different than we thought. So that's just that was just a diffusion of 4 different ideas that came together in a particular guy. In part, he was
Right.
helped by the fact that he was in the patent office because he was analyzing
Certainly.
patents that had to do with the speed of light between train stations because they had to synchronize the train stations. So anyway, it's a really
Right.
interesting case,
I certainly agree. Almost all invention is really recombination. And so
which makes
when
it
you think about
diffusion, right? Which
it's a form of diffusion, but
yeah,
then diffusion also happens. When somebody invents a new kind of thing, it
it's
also
got
needs to diffuse. And then sometimes institutions get in the way of that. Sometimes they support it. So that also matters. Even when the invention doesn't change that much, it needs to adapt somewhat to local
needs to spread,
conditions.
right?
And that it's important to have incentives to do that. Now, one of the things I think we economists know that maybe other people don't about innovation is the thing you mentioned about being roughly proportional to economic activity, that the more people are doing more things, the more innovation happens. And that's a warning about fertility, because if population declines and economics activity declines, then innovation will decline in more than proportion. So that means that after a population peak, if we have a declining economy and population, we could well have a period of much less innovation. And
Right.
that's a problem, I think, because much of our liberality of the modern world, I think, has been caused by innovation. That is, there was a time when the most successful societies seemed to be very innovative and supportive of innovation. They were the most militarily and economically powerful. And the rest of the world said, hey, we got to copy this. That's one of the key elements of cultural evolution, is copying the successful. And that's why the world is now much more liberal and open than it was, is because of those few leaders being copied. But in a world with declining innovation, there'll be much less need or pressure to support innovation through liberality. So we may well just shut down many of these channels of communication and exchange of ideas. So the most intellectuals up until a few centuries ago were actually what's called esoteric. That is, they didn't say out loud clearly the things they believed. They were afraid of governments and religious authorities, etc., disapproving of what they said. And so there was just much less spread of ideas because of each set of experts, say, having a tight group of people they talked to more directly, but, in code. And then it was harder to exchange ideas across larger scales. And we could return to that sort of world. That is, we could lose the liberal world of a large exchange of ideas that are relatively directly expressed and understood and therefore drawn on by our large world if we lose innovation and liberality. And more fundamentally, this is maybe the best example to me of, look, if you're in your civilization, you probably like some things about your civilization. And if it's replaced by some other civilization, one of the things you should see as a cost is those things you like going away. The Christians dropped many things they didn't like about the Roman Empire. And the Amish and Haredim, if they're our successors, they will pick and choose from among what we have that they like. And they are famously not so open-minded. They're not into open inquiry. They're not into a lot of technology. And that's a risk of the fall of our civilization being replaced. And a reason maybe to think about what we could do to prevent that. I'm not less indifferent once you realize that some of these more fundamental things that you don't realize you cherish are in fact things that we commonly cherish are at risk.
Yeah, one thing I've been wondering is to what degree we could mitigate any the fertility declines. There's still plenty of room for increasing cognitive diversity
Sure.
and flow. Trust has actually been declining in some places, especially in the U.S. So that's something that's going to hurt innovation, is declining trust levels. But if there were something, we could talk about ways to increase trust, but we should be thinking about how to
Sure.
use cultural evolution to increase trust. This is all if you think that innovation can help us get out of these
Well,
problems.
innovation is good just for many reasons, even if it can't get us out of these things. But I think a warning is the fact that, say, for at least 50 years, the whole world have heard about, say, the wonders of Silicon Valley as an innovation machine. And much of the world says, we want to be the next Silicon Valley of X over here. And they have tried consistently to emulate Silicon Valley, to emulate the innovation there, and largely failed.
That's right.
So even though there's enormous spatial variation in innovation rates, you could say, look, the fact that innovation in Silicon Valley is so much more innovative than other places suggests there's a lot of room for improvement we could change elsewhere. But the fact that people tried to copy and fail warns that that's pretty tough.
Yeah, I would be so. One of the things I've been trying to learn more about is what are when people try to emulate Silicon Valley or CEOs try to make their company more innovative. At least one main strategy that I see people trying is they're spurred by the myth of the heroic inventor, and they just try to hire a lot of really smart people. And that's not the magic. That's not where the magic is. You've got to create the
Right.
environment where, and you need young people as well, hiring people who are already well known for their,
Right. They also
there's a
think
lot of
that
one-trick ponies out there.
they think, well, we need more creativity, more open-mindedness, being more bohemian. So many cities have actually been sold on this idea that you just need more bohemians and then your city will prosper.
Right.
So,
Right. So
have
you got to bring in
some,
like a lot of jazz clubs and
right. Or just, yeah, hash joints or whatever it is that is people's image of bohemian. And that
right,
hasn't really worked very well either.
right.
So
But like
fundamentally, we
just
don't
making
understand.
this point about diversity. So I think the paper you might have been referring to on the collective brain, we looked at the diversity within U.S. counties from 1850 to 1940, and we're able to get some causal inference because counties have immigrants that are for relatively random reasons are arriving in different counties at different times. And so we can look at whether you get a charge of diversity based on last names. And what we find is that if you inject more surname diversity into these counties, you get a boost in patents and breakthrough patents. We think that that's evidence for the value of this cognitive diversity and for immigration, especially immigration from diverse places, potentially powering innovation.
So you're familiar, I presume, with the concept of hybrid vigor.
Yep.
So the idea is that the world had a lot of genetic diversity, but each place had a lot of correlation. And so each place wasn't drawing from the world's genetic diversity, it was only drawing from local genetic diversity. And that as the worlds become more mixed together, we're getting largely a one-time boost from taking this variety and integrating it more together worldwide. But the warning is that after you have that world integration, that's you don't get further growth rates of boost necessarily. You get the boost from the initial mixing of the different varieties. And so I worry about that for culture.
Okay. Yeah. That may be the case. Although there is the situation I suggested where, and it's hard to know what the right measurement is here, but where you get places that are they're culturally influenced by the global culture, but they're also integrating that with their own way of doing things, producing a new third thing. Now, you might counter, well, it's still more similar to the global culture than it was before. That's probably true, but it is a production of some new cultural variation, which could potentially be harnessed. It's a new experiment, so to speak.
Right. So, I mean, to me, the most disturbing thing is these strong global pressures for homogeneity. That is, even if you think about different cultural, technological variations, the more, say, the world has its shared opinion about what the proper social media is, then any one place deviating from that will seem illicit and need to be repressed because we all agree on the proper concept of it. So, for example, nuclear energy has been this great potential for half a century that's been hardly realized because the world has had a pretty strong convergent opinion about the dangers of nuclear energy and how it needs to be very carefully repressed. And again, we talked about organ sales and medical experiments, lots of areas where the world just has these strong opinions now about the proper way to do things. And those are getting in the way of variety, even if there's a potential for variety. Technically, culturally, it can be limited.
Now, don't you think that variety could be increased with the decline of American prestige and influence? Because it seems like some of this was driven by, the strong influence of the United States.
Right. So I think that's like a hybrid bigger effect over the last century or so. That is because we had all these diverse cultures that were adaptive locally, roughly. Then there was a best culture and people became aware of this best culture and they decided to copy it. That produces a gain for a while as the world changes their practices from the local practices to this global best practice. But then once that's more adopted, now to have improvements then, if we've lost the variety, we may be less able to improve that. So, yes.
I guess what I'm thinking is there's always going to be local variety, but sometimes that gets stamped out by these more top-down influences. So if there's less top to push down, or at least there's multiple poles or whatever, then you can get more of the surviving variety. Does that make sense?
Right. But so I think we think of many things as American and world culture that are actually world culture, not American now. That is, some things started out as American culture, but they became global. So for example, in Europe, they have a Globish, a version of English. And it's not American English or British English. It's a smaller, simplified version of English that works in the European Union, say, government, and that other people around the world can speak. And there are other elements of culture that have become like that. So much of Europe disapproves of U.S. policy in many ways and U.S. culture in many ways. And then many elites around the world largely agree with that. For example, opinions on Israel are pretty strongly uniformly against Israel all around the world. And U.S. is an exception to some degree. And there are many policy areas on which that's true. So yes, the world is moving away from America, but not toward a variety of things, toward a new global elite consensus.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to look at that. I mean, I hear you. I'm not sure that's true, but I definitely see the forces you're talking about.
I think the clearest thing is if I just point you on to, say, 3 centuries time scale, it's just obvious that there has been a convergence.
Yeah,
So I think people
there's
often
been
get
some
too focused on
I
the
mean,
last 20 years or something
right.
instead of looking at centuries long time scale and just trusting the
Well,
long
sure. I
term
mean, because
trends to
there's
continue.
been this massive diffusion of institutions that started in Europe, government institutions, corporate institutions, educational institutions. Yeah.
And even now, when you travel the world, cities are just much more alike each other today than they were, say, 50 or 100 years ago. It's just much harder to travel to find an exotic city,
You mean like the airports look the same,
right? The
the
streets look the same, the coffee
right,
shops looks the same, and
they're Starbucks, right?
right, their Wi-Fi looks the same. I mean, right. That's a world of convergent culture,
Right.
especially among elites, which,
Yeah.
as you know, elites are often typically the predictor of future culture. That on average, culture follows elite. And so if the elites are no more homogeneous, that does predict that the others will become more homogeneous with time.
Right. Right. Yeah, but I guess I want to come back to the idea that eventually these things all fall apart, right? So um,
It's
I
not
think
reassuring, you know.
yeah, well,
Don't think the audience is going, oh, phew.
yeah, things fall apart. So
It's all going to fall apart. For God's sake, what?
yeah, I can guarantee it. Guarantee it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of when.
Right. But like in economic policy, if we predict a big disaster, then we focus on, oh my God, let's focus on this, figure out what to do. Like that's that's the start of the conversation, not the end of it. Right. Whereas I feel like for many people in cultural evolution, they just go, my hands are clean. I'm just studying the abstract culture. Like that isn't my job to fix the individual cultures, which it doesn't need to be. Somebody's job should be
Yeah. Yeah.
to take the inside
I,
view and say, what does this say?
yeah. No, I think that's right. But I also think there is some advantage to keeping the two distinct. I mean, I guess
Sure.
people disagree on that, but I think it's harder to do a good job because one of the things is I find when I policy people, sometimes I feel like they already know what they want the policy to be, and then they're searching around in the science to find the stuff that supports what they think the policy should already be.
And
Uh,
if we just go meta with that, that's an interesting fact about culture. So our cultural capacity to aggregate information across different people and context is more limited when we have stronger value commitments to the topic. So culture has so far, say, generated, say, academia and even some areas of science or engineering where you can have shared evaluations where people have very different interests, but they come together and they produce and verify roughly the same analysis of the complicated situation. And that's a remarkable capacity humans have generated. And that's allowed a lot of innovation.
right,
And
right.
what I think I noticed when I got into social science, say from computer science and physics, where I was before, is that it's just much harder for people to overcome their interest in the topic to share evaluations and share analyses. And so a key question about humanity in the future is, will we find better ways to do that, to be able to produce shared, and especially about culture. So my
Right.
experience, this cultural evolution topic is the worst. I can get economists to roughly pretend to be the neutral economists and use our shared standards to evaluate things, even if they actually disagree about the policy, because we have the shared structure. With cultural evolution, it just goes so much to the heart of values and what people care about. It's just really hard for them to step outside of the values and
I see.
think about what the process does, as opposed to embrace their culture's values.
Right.
And
Right.
so, this is a key question. Like, I was thinking of maybe humanity needs to escape cultural evolution. That is, maybe we will just suffer a lot if we continue to be subject to the existing form of cultural evolution. We need to find some way to be more deliberate about it or more conscious of it or something. But that's a key question here. I now see. So I have this book about the future called Age of M that I wrote a decade ago.
Yeah.
And
I think I listened to
it's
the audiobook.
okay. Well, I'm honored. But it's assuming that growth would just continue as it has over the last century or two. And that seemed to me a reasonable projection then, and now it seems less reasonable. And so now I see humanity having this Achilles heel
Yeah,
of
yeah.
being subject to cultural evolution and not being very aware of it and not really able to manage it because we can't even see it. And that'll just mean it'll take a lot longer to get achieve these visions, even though
Yeah.
plausibly we still eventually.
I mean, as an academic, I'm always wary of emphasizing the role of the university too much. But I mean, I suspect you may agree with me that the social sciences are a bit of a mess. I mean, we have all these different social sciences. They all study
Right?
roughly the same topic. There's no
Sure.
unifying framework. So, I mean, one endeavor for a guy like me is to try to, rebuild the social sciences, because we don't need all of these different social sciences. I think we need a branch of social science. I mean, a social science that
Right.
is a branch of the life sciences and uses all the tools from across the biological and social sciences to think about humans. Immediately, we're a product of evolution, but we're also a cultural species with all this kind of downstream stuff, rather than, the way I think that some of my colleagues in the social sciences do business, right?
I actually think that I've been able to integrate the different social sciences into a integrated point of view. It takes more work, and you have to be a bit more of a polymath. But I
Yeah.
don't think they're actually that much in conflict with each other. I think the more fundamental problem. I mean, having been in the physical sciences and engineering, the same sort of minds are the minds here. It's just it is actually harder to think about things when you care about them.
Mm.
And the reason why physics and computer science could make more rapid progress is fundamentally, emotionally, we don't really care about those subjects. you know, there could be black holes, there could not be black holes, you could sort of list one way, sort of lever. And on a deep emotional level, we just don't care. And
So
that
when
allows us to be neutral.
So I can certainly see how you could integrate within a framework results from the other social sciences. But don't you find that there's epistemological differences between the practitioners of anthropology, say cultural anthropology, many parts of sociology and economics or biology?
I mean, there are ways people frame things differently, but the question is, can I find a coherent representation of which they are all, instances? Is there a way to think about them as all being roughly right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think there roughly is.
Okay.
But often the conclusions are the things that make people mad. That is, I can import insights from sociology about status and things into economics, except it's going to disagree with some existing economics conclusions or vice versa. So it is, in fact, the conflict over the conclusions that seems to be the fundamental obstacle to this sort of integration. Uh,
Right.
people have to be willing to embrace a result that some analysis or evidence supports, somewhat independent of their opinion about it, or what they want to
Exactly.
believe, right? Which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
really hard, actually, quite hard. So here's a simple example that should show you the scale of the problem. We have a literature on the effectiveness of medicine, and we have a variety of quality of that literature. Some of it's very, sloppy and quick and dirty, and others is more rigorous methods. And we have the most rigorous methods of all being randomized experiments. And so we have a half dozen randomized experiments of aggregate effective medicine. And the consistent result from those is no effect. So the obvious conclusion is medicine on average has no effect, and nobody wants to believe that. So they just go, well, that's kind of weird. I hope we figure that out someday. And they just go with the other conclusions they want to go with because that's just too disturbing. And we have a lot of things like that in social science I've come across over the years where the empirics are kind of clear about a very disturbing, unwelcome answer.
Yeah.
And mostly people just bracket it off and say, I hope we figure that out someday. And they go on with the usual conclusions they wanted to have.
Right. Right.
That's, to me, the more fundamental problem in social science is when we see something, not looking away.
Right, not looking away. And I guess one of the things I've been looking at lately is the the intensity of research on different topics over the last 50 years. And it looks like the social sciences studied a lot more diverse topics in the past, and the number of
Yeah,
papers
I
on
agree.
has gotten more narrow on a subset of topics.
That may be related to the fall of theory. So, in many academic areas, say roughly half centuries ago, theory was king. and empirics were more subsidiary in support of theory. And now empirics are king, even in cultural evolution, I think. And therefore, there's less openness to other theoretical framings because theory just has less prestige and weight and able to persuade people of things. So then we get sort of stuck in the previous generation of theories because that's what had prestige and, impact when theory was strong.
Great.
And we may take another 60 years for the tide to turn, or if it will, I don't know. But that's a key fact about academia at the moment. Is theory is minor, data is king. And I see that your research is primarily data driven, right? You have some theoretical perspectives that you bring to the data, but you're mostly pushing the state of the art in the empirics, right? Because that's what most of social science and most of academia does.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm just curious, before we close things up here, do you see much influence from cultural evolution into your field of economics?
I have several colleagues, one of them is a co-author with you on this
so he
recent
doesn't
paper
count.
of yours, who are, thinking about cultural evolution, but again, primarily from an empirical point of view. There is relatively little energy or interest in economics or anywhere for reconsidering sort of the basic theoretical framings of things.
Okay.
And that's, so to the extent somebody could just take it as an empirical exercise and then go with it, then people are fine with that. But whether people are willing to, say, reconsider the basics of government or medicine or other sorts of things in cultural evolution terms, that seems, more harder to do just because we're just less open to reframing our basic concepts in general.
You actually have two colleagues who are co-authors.
Yes, I do.
They're both named Jonathan. But
right. Schultz and Beauchamp.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
Good.
And, they're great colleagues, and we just gave them tenure recently or promoted them. So,
good to hear that.
And
good. So anything we should talk about while we're closing things up here? Any uncovered topics on your list?
So you wanted to bring up innovation because you were writing on that. I'm happy to make sure we covered that enough. I will want to say that I've said this to students before. If we could find enough things to say, it would make sense to have more than half of our courses on innovation. Innovation is just fundamentally that important. It's the major driver of change and variety in the world. The fact is, when we try to find things to say, we can't find that much. So as economists, we've worked on institutions for innovation. So there's patents and copyrights and, prizes and things like that. And it turns out we just don't get very far with that sort of empirical or theoretical analysis. And so there's just this huge uncertainty we have in what to do about innovation. We know it's really important. We know we have these levers, but we can't actually figure out a consistent relationship between our levers and the outcome we want. That's a surprising fact of our ignorance about innovation.
Well, good.
And it means there's an opening for doing better.
We got about 3 chapters left to write, so we'll see.
Well, I hope you find novel, interesting things to say about it, because it's definitely way more important than its shelf space in the library. It's overwhelmingly important.
Yeah.
And we still just struggle to understand some basics about it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found amazing is that the same principles of the collective brain seem to apply to things like patents, technological innovations, as well as to things like poetry and philosophy and other domains, movie scripts that might seem paintings that might seem very far from technological. So it's all about human endeavors and
It's worth mentioning that like schools often try to claim that they want to promote creativity and innovation, and they in fact don't. They in fact squash it in students and most employers as well. That is, our society gives lip service to innovation, but in most contexts, innovation looks like noise. Yeah. So most workplace practices and training programs, et cetera, are in practice trying to suppress innovation because they are trying to produce reliable, workflow and practices.
A well-functioning cog doesn't suddenly do different things.
So it's less about promoting an individual attitude and love of innovation and more about finding ways for organizations and processes to support it. That's the kind of lesson here, really. That's more a way of saying diffusion as opposed to invention. We focus on innovations, making sure your heart is pure and that you're feeling creative and open and that you're like not limiting yourself in what you think about or all those sorts of things. We like the story of the individual inventor or creative in their state
Right.
of mind. But we honestly have way more inventions than we ever actually pursue. That's the key thing. There's this bottleneck. People have ideas, but can they get their boss or their
Yeah.
organization to try it out? Can they get
Yeah.
somebody to support it? That's the limiting factor.
Right.
Judging which innovations are worth pursuing how is the thing we need to do better at. And that's where we struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. There are tons of unrealized innovations out there just waiting. Because it's hard to capitalize some things. It's hard to start a company on some things.
Anyway, I have more ideas on that, but we've probably done
Yeah.
enough for one
We'll discuss
discussion.
that in our next meeting,
If we do, yes,
which will
please, I'd love to.
hopefully be
Thank you for
soon.
discussing.
Anyway, thanks a lot, Robin.